Joining us now via Skype from Goa, India, Anand Giridharadas. He is the author of India Calling, an intimate portrait of the nation's remaking. He also writes for the New York Times. And Anand, we're very glad to have you on our program tonight. How are you doing from halfway around the world?
Terrific. Great to be on your show again.
We're happy to have you back. Your story, we're going to remind people, actually begins in the United States. Your parents emigrated from India in the 1970s, but you were born and grew up in suburban Cleveland. So as a child, what did India mean to you?
You know, India was at first just the piece of knowledge that there was a country other than the country we were in that my parents had chosen to leave. That was the first piece of information about India available to us. And growing up in Cleveland, which I don't need to tell your viewers is not New York or Los Angeles or London, there were really not that many other Indians, not much of an Indian community, not much of a community of people not from Cleveland. And so Indianness was almost like this secret garden, as I talk about in the book, that we had access to when we wanted, but we couldn't really dwell in because we were really very much in Ohio, and it was these kind of secret ways that we dressed sometimes, and these secret ways that we ate a few times a week, and these secret kinds of weddings we had, and stories of my parents' childhoods and of a life completely different from the life we were living as children. But it was this kind of optional parallel world to the real world that we seemed to be growing up in.
In fact, I think the word you used in the book was that India seemed frozen to you when you went and visited it as a child. What do you mean by frozen?
You know, it was frozen to us because when, first of all, we had that preliminary knowledge that it was a place our parents had voted with their feet to leave. And that sense of being a place too frozen to give them lives of energy and lives to kind of fulfill their ambition was confirmed when we'd go back and really rediscovered a country that where the people of their age, of our parents' age, seemed so different from our parents. In America, our parents had found this opportunity to constantly reinvent themselves, change their ideas, discard traditions that didn't make sense to them, and pick new traditions that did, and be engaged in this kind of cycle of making and remaking. And India seemed, on the other hand, to be a place very much stuck in a kind of feudal, traditional mold, where ideas and ways of life didn't change. And of course, this was the socialist period in India, where adding to that frozenness was a kind of economic, financial frozenness. People didn't have resources, and everything in a place without resources feels stuck. And that contrast very much shaped my relationship with India from the beginning. It seemed at first, before I rediscovered it and fell in love with it many years later, those visits seemed to validate my parents' decision to get out.
But that attitude you just described, is that why you felt you were in some respects doing them a favor by going over to visit?
It did feel like that. I mean, I enjoyed it, and we have relatives that we loved there, and so I enjoyed my time there. But it always felt like a kind of return to someone else's country. So long before it became a place that I now consider a territory of my own, long before I would have dreamed of writing a book about it, it was a place with which I felt very estranged.
But you were American, even though, if I can put it this way, you looked Indian. So when you were there and people asked you what you were, how did you respond?
You know, I've been asked that when I was a little boy. I've been asked that as a teenager, and I've been asked that certainly after writing a book about India. And my answers have evolved from time to time, but in a way, the answer is always inconclusive. The times in my life when I felt most Indian are when I'm in a situation that makes me uncomfortable, and the times I felt most American are when I'm somewhere in the middle of India, and that feels difficult. In a way, you discover where you're from by also discovering where you're not from. And I think my own fate is to be in between these two places, really remarkable places to be from.
Well, let us get into some conversation about how you have now rediscovered India, if I can put it that way. Let's go to the year 2003. You're just out of college. You want to be a writer. You decide you're going to go to India to do some consulting work. What was your parents' reaction when you told them you wanted to go, I don't say back to India because you're not from there, but you wanted to go to India to put in some roots of your own?
They were, in contrast to most parents of children who did the same thing, and there started to be dozens and then hundreds and then thousands of them in the last decade. My parents were unique in being very much supportive of this. They thought it was a good idea. They were a little bit surprised by it because prior to this, there'd been no specific expression of interest in India on my part, but they welcomed it. I think they thought I would go for 6 months or a year and a half, which is what I thought I would do. And then a year and a half became 2 years, and it became 4 years, and it became 6 years eventually. And I think that surprised them. It surprised them that I now was spending most of my 20s in the country that they had left in their 20s. But they were all the while delighted by it. The only moment where it became a little bit interesting was far into my time in India, about 5.5 years in. My sister, who was working in California at a technology company, got a kind of tentative opportunity to move with that company to Hyderabad in southern India. And my mother instant messaged me at that moment and just asked me, "What are Papa and I doing here?" Meaning doing in America. If my sister were to have ended up there, which she didn't in the end, it would have been a bit bizarre for our two parents to be in their suburban home in Washington alone, a home that stands for all their dreams for us children, while the children were pursuing their dreams back in India.
Well, it's an excellent question. You got to admit it. I mean, they left there presumably for self-renewal and to find a better life in the United States, the place which people are dying to become citizens of, and you have that, and you leave that to go back to where they came from. I mean, I guess you can understand why they might have felt that you were making an odd choice in some respects.
Children will stop at nothing to find ways to make their parents' lives surprising and difficult.
Don't I know it?
So,
yes.
But I think I thought about this a lot when I was in India, and I came to this conclusion that there are two ways to interpret my parents' story and the logic of their lives. The first way is to interpret it as a story of westward migration. And that, to my view, is a narrow way of interpreting what their life was about. But if you interpret it that way, yes, you're exactly right. Their life was about struggling to move west, and I reversed it by going east. I think the second interpretation of my parents' situation is that they were not moving in a particular direction, but like so many migrants throughout human history, they were making a new life on someone else's soil. And doing that partly because that soil may have been better than their own soil, but also because there's an opportunity to reinvent yourself on any soil that is not your soil of birth. And so when I, again, moved halfway around the world just as they once had, I think it didn't matter, actually, that it was to the place that they had left. I was doing exactly the thing that they did, except in this case, in the year 2003, the future perhaps was in the East, and the opportunity to reinvent myself could not come the same way on the soil in which I had sprouted. It had to come somewhere else, and that somewhere else just happened to be their soil.
Fascinating. Okay, so I asked you what your parents thought about what you were doing. Now I want to ask you what your fellow Indians think about the fact that you've left the United States of America to go, in some respects, I know not really, but in some respects, returning to India. And how do your contemporaries in India regard your choice?
As with everything in India, there is a wonderful cacophonous multiplicity of opinion on this question. For the most part, the fundamental reality of India is of a profoundly welcoming, open society. And so it's not just me, but people over the centuries who've always felt welcomed in India. And so when someone who looks like me goes back, it's not difficult to feel fundamentally welcome. The friendships that I had a chance to form in India are lifelong friendships, and friendships of a kind that you find very rarely anywhere else in the world. I've been back to India 4 times in the last year or so, and just the kinds of relationships that were forged in those 6 years are just really powerful. At the same time, there are understandably suspicions about why a group of people whose parents jumped ship, you might say, now want to come back and make their lives in India once now that kind of economic growth is thriving and things are looking up. And there's a feeling of kind of profiteering on the way down and now profiteering on the way up. And I think those feelings will always be there, and every country grapples with a certain amount of anti-migrant sentiment. But on the whole, I'd rather be an Indian American in India than many other configurations of migrant in the world.
Well, in fact, you said, quote, money is God now in India. And let me ask you how happy you think people in India are, if that is in fact the case.
You know, it's a great question, and I think the relationship between money and happiness and all kinds of things in happiness is something we're just beginning to understand in a kind of more rigorous way around the world. I think I would not make a claim about India becoming more or less happy overall, but I would argue that the kind of happiness that defines India, the kind of pursuit of happiness that defines India, what counts as the happiness to be pursued, is in the midst of changing hugely. And you can define a society by the kind of happiness it chooses to chase. In the United States, where I grew up, the definition of happiness has a lot to do with the kind of individual freedom to be left alone. I think in the traditional India that my parents left, happiness had a lot to do with involvement in the lives of others and others' involvement in your lives, with a kind of mutuality. I think that vision of happiness, though very much still alive in India, is giving way to a new and rival understanding of happiness that really puts the self much more at the center of things. That makes a lot of people more happy. I think it also leaves a lot of people behind. And as you say, money is God, and a large part of the happiness pursuit that defines young people in today's India at various levels of society is the pursuit of meaning and joy through money. And sometimes money does in fact bring meaning and joy, particularly when you don't have much. But it can also, the more you have, become a very futile chase. And I think that's one of the many questions that India is wrestling with today.
Well, I don't say this in a pejorative way at all, but of course, many in the United States believe that happiness there equals the ability to make as much money as possible. And I wonder whether you are seeing signs that that feeling is becoming much more widespread in India as well.
It is. And to draw a contrast with the United States and many places in the West, what actually concerns me about India is that view is actually more unrivaled in India than it is in the United States. So if you take a country like the United States, there's certainly a materialism and a money chase, but there are large, powerful institutions that act on people that pull in very opposite ways. There's religious organizations, there's civic organizations, there's kind of charitable impulses, there's ideologies, and so not everybody is in a kind of materialism maximizing posture. What's happened in places like India, and I would say China also, where I've spent a little bit of time, is this money thing was so suppressed for such a long time that when people now finally have the freedom to kind of make as much money as they can, it becomes the only goal in the society. And I actually find India in that regard much more unbalanced today than most countries in the West, in which you find most people tending to kind of manage and optimize many variables at the same time, not one. Just to give you one example, I went to a good college in the United States, University of Michigan, and I would say most people that I went to college with did not choose the highest earning job offer they could get. Some did, but others became teachers and theater directors and farm people and all kinds of things. And that's not the case in places like India and China. People are right now in the mode of doing the thing that gets them the top dollar or rupee or renminbi.
I wonder if you've ever asked your parents if the India today is an India that they would have left had this been the country they lived in back in the 1970s. Have you asked that? And if so, what did they say?
Well, I'm smiling because that's a complicated question. It's hard to ask someone if, in a way, the entire premise of their life has now unraveled. We talk about it all the time in different ways, if not in so many words. And I don't think it's a clear answer. I don't think anybody, to be honest, would ever really be able to say with clarity, if I was there today, I would do this instead of that. It's such a different universe that it's hard for them to imagine who would they be. Would they be one of those people, one of these people? What would their situation be? It's hard to imagine. But when they come back, and they come back at least once a year and spend some time here every summer now, more than they did before, they are amazed by an India that has, in many ways, just shocked them in its power to replicate, in some ways leapfrog over the society to which they came. And I think for them as individuals, it's hard to imagine at this stage entirely going back to India, because life is still hard in India at every level in certain ways. But I think they do ask the question, if history had come crashing a generation earlier in the way that it did, would fate have turned out different?
And finally, let me ask the question of you. Can you imagine that this is the country that you will decide to spend the rest of your life in?
You know, I think that it's, for me, not a question of the rest of my life in any country. I think the further fulfillment for me of my parents' journey is that I, like them, cannot imagine all of my life spent in one place. But what 6 years in India absolutely did convince me of is that India is not my parents' country alone, it's mine. It's one of mine. And I want to, and so far have, since leaving India full-time a year and a half ago, spent a part of every year in India, spent summers, come back repeatedly, and this will be a part of every year of my life, and I'm sure I will come again for another period of years. And who knows? It's very possible that I will spend even longer than that. It is one of the most exciting places in the world, and it's a place where not just my heritage kind of comes back to me, but a place where all of the things that you and I care about in the world in terms of democracy and ethnic collaboration and cooperation and coexistence and the rule of law and pluralism, they all come together. And it's an extremely exciting experiment that should matter to us all.
Anand, it's great to have you on TVO again. I hope next time you're in Canada, you'll come by and actually visit us in the studio so we can shake hands. Your book is India Calling, an intimate portrait of a nation's remaking. And we're so glad you had some time for us today from Goa, India, via Skype. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it.